Hello, and welcome to the second part of our game theory special about Strixhaven, a curriculum of chaos. And fortunately, I'm joined by Fiona, who will help us navigate through the crunch of the matter. So just straight up warning to everyone, there will be spoilers here. We're going to go into some of the detail behind the book. We're going to go into some of the magic items you might encounter if you play through the adventure. We might talk a little bit about some of the monsters and how they appear in some of the adventures. So if you are faint-hearted or you are concerned that you will ruin your enjoyment of this book, then like, subscribe, do all that good stuff, and we'll see you after you've played through the encounter. But if you're still here with us, welcome as we come back to Strixhaven, as we return to the college. So, crunchiness.
Yes.
Fiona, I actually was looking through the book at Crunchy-wise. It's actually relatively thin on new crunch and relatively a lot of monsters and new sort of creatures, which I think is really great. And there's a lot of NPCs and archetypes and stereotypes. How would you summarize the new crunchy things in Strixhaven?
I think this is a really good point. As we sort of said last episode, we talked about how there has been a big shift away from full-on combat. Strixhaven is not a dungeon crawl at all, right? It is just you trying to get to the end of school. And as a result, it's less likely that you'll have random encounters on campus with huge monsters, that sort of thing. So now they're trying to supplement it with other rules for maybe social interaction, what happens when you go to university, you have exams, you have to keep up with jobs, you've got to do extracurricular stuff. You have to, have friendships, like be a part of a community. So what they've done is actually created lots of different optional rules, which I think work to an extent, and maybe could be done with some tweaking as well. But there's some really interesting things in here, which is what we're going to look at today.
Well, let's start with the obvious. I was going to say elephant in the room, but it's not elephant because that was Ravnica. The obvious owl in the room. Now, Owlin are apparently a Feywild race that's sort of just been suitably inserted. Now, I'm not one for talking animals and that sort of nonsense in my mind. But I can see the appeal from a crunchy perspective because it's another creature that gets fly at level 1 and one might say, the bonus proficiency you get is stealth. That's fun. What do you think about that?
Yeah, you're a proper silent assassin, aren't you? Yes, it is one of, I believe, only 2 creatures that have sort of flight speed at level 1. The other one is obviously Aarakocra. And interestingly enough, this build of Owlin has dramatically shifted from the Unearthed Arcana. I think a couple of months ago we had Folks of the Feywild, which introduced the sort of hare race, the sort of fairy race, and all that sort of thing. And Owlin was in there. And they had a whole lot of stuff. They had like a trait where if they were sort of knocked prone whilst they flew, like through the air, they could make a check and just learn to hover instead, which makes them super overpowered if you're trying to throw stuff at them. So thankfully they've taken that one out of this. But yeah, you get dark vision up to 120 feet, which makes sense because obviously owls have massive eyes. And yeah, they have that flight speed equal to their walking speed. And you can also be medium or small. Again, another one which I don't think we have many in terms of different sizes. So you could have a whole range of very flavorful owls, how different they look and everything like that. And I think this is the first time, I'm sure we've seen it in other books like Wild Beyond the Witchlight, where there isn't any, you have to put certain modifiers in certain traits, if you see what I mean, or certain pluses into certain things. This is obviously a big move towards that sort of thing where you could have an Owlin that is magical or is a fighter or is something in between, but you're not having to necessarily be stuck into those roles because of some natural proficiencies that they had. So there's a whole lot I think you can do with it. I agree, as the DM in me sort of goes, oh no, flight at level 1, what am I going to do? But actually, I think there's a lot of things you can do with that, certainly in this campaign. I think Owlin in Strixhaven makes a lot of sense because, again, it's very magical. There's lots of things where you might need to get to higher places and stuff. You're not trapped within a dungeon and you have to get over it to a ledge. You could be using it to go through the campus and all that sort of thing. So yeah.
The premise behind the Owlin is that they don't actually do a great deal of telling you about what your background is, how you interact with other species or otherwise on ancestries and backgrounds. There is literally less than half a page, I would say, on the Owlin.
this is the thing for me. I wouldn't mind having a little bit more background on them. So the other books obviously talk about, what kind of communities they have, where are they likely to live in different planes and stuff. And for Strixhaven to have such a multitude of races coming to learn and stuff like that makes total sense to keep it sort of brief. But I do think it's kind of a shame. We see some incredible imagery here of certainly owls, flying and casting spells and stuff. Are they mostly a magical community in the past, or is it a whole mixture of stuff? Like, I've always been quite interested in that sort of thing, but that's just my personal preference. So they could have just done an extra paragraph or two, just saying a bit more about it. Other than I think they say, oh, you might be nocturnal, you might be a night owl, and that was kind of it, just 2 lines. I thought, oh,
no, that's pretty fair, and I do think it's probably because, like I say, it's my aversion to talking animals that makes me kind of go, yeah, that's fine. I really, like it's quite short, so I don't mind passing over that page, right? But exactly. I do see your point in that there isn't a huge amount to work with in terms of what's your society like, or what would it have been like growing up as an owl, kind of thing.
Yeah, would you have like loads of brothers and sisters, or are you mostly solitary? And again, maybe this is just me as a DM. I would like that a little bit more detail, and maybe for players as well, just something to bounce off and create. But maybe this is just like, hey, the setting is enough. It is a magical school. You don't need necessarily a whole history of like the Owlin clan you've come through or something like that. But that's just me on that front.
Well, I would imagine going to Strixhaven as an Owlin would be a hoot.
Right.
Right. So moving on. There's a bunch of stuff about backgrounds. We talked about that in episode 1. But looking through this, in my mind, crunch-wise, I would say that Prismari and Quandrix have the better end of the stick on this. You get sort of Guiding Bolt in Quandrix at level 1. You get Thunderwave on Chromatic Orb for Prismari. And then at level 3, they both get Haste, which is
pretty good,
spicy,
useful.
Right? And so your Twilight Cleric has just become a little bit overpowered at that point, I feel. But actually, I did like looking through the various backgrounds and other pieces that go with it. They are, in contrast, I would say, perhaps, to the Owlin, they're pretty in-depth and comprehensive. I mean, you have the usual sort of tables of here's some things that might represent your trinkets and personality traits and other things, but they tie together very well, and they do, I feel, give a good bit of background to a character that is going to attend this school.
Yes, agreed.
The other major thing is, as always with Crunch, is feats. And the feats are
limited.
I would say underwhelming.
Yes, I definitely think this is okay. So we kind of mentioned it a little bit in the last episode, but there's essentially 2 new feats that they've introduced into Strixhaven. There's one that is the Strixhaven Initiate feat, which is, we sort of talked about that idea that even if you're not necessarily playing a magical class, using this feat, you get a few little bits of spell casting, which again makes sense. You're at a university that is studying how to apply magic to things. So it makes sense that everyone gets one, if you see what I mean. Mm-hmm. And then the second one is a Strixhaven mascot. So you learn how to summon one of these mascots that are tied to one of your colleges. So, you can use it almost as like your companion S that can take one of your attacks to make its own attack as a reaction and all that sort of thing. And one thing I do like about that is that you can use essentially an action to teleport and switch places with the mascot. Because obviously in my head, when I think of mascots, I think of people, dressed up in those huge big suits and whatnot. So then suddenly, just as a big Owlin perhaps, and he's just switching your place, and then suddenly this poor little creature's like, Arr! And then gets hit by something amazingly big, or gets crushed by something because you just switched out of the way of it as well. So I think that aspect of it could be quite fun, but I don't know how much I would use it as compared to other feats, if you see what I mean.
It is reminiscent of that conjurer ability. I can't remember what it's called. I think it's benign transposition or something like that, where they're able to see an item that I think they've created, or if not, but regardless, they're able to swap with it. But I think that's a little bit of a higher level feat. Then this is a 4th level feat, and it's sort of it's long rest limited, so it's not terrible. And I imagine it's probably quite useful for, certain parts of the adventures where you need to reach parts where, Owlins can fly, but perhaps your tiefling mage is not able to reach there, and so here's my mascot to the rescue, right? So it gives you some interesting problem solving abilities, one might say.
I think that's a good point. It's like you're faced with sort of everyday problems within the context of you are at school, right? So compared to like, we're going to need rope, we're going to need all this equipment and stuff, you're having to use and like what you have to hand and think outside the box. So I do love that idea that you're just using mascots to switch your way up like a really steep hill or something like that, something different like that. Again, maybe this is a common theme in Strixhaven as we're seeing. It seems to be light on certain things, but maybe that's to encourage you to think of ways how to use it, differently. That's a rule of cool idea.
Bang on. Now, by contrast, however, and arguably a little bit controversially, I think some of the spells are a little spicy, one might say. So, Borrowed Knowledge, a second level divination spell, which in fairness, I think second level can actually balance this out, gives you an hour where you gain a proficiency in something that you fancy. So you just kind of go, oh, well, you know what? Here's my spell. I'm just going to go off and just be proficient in acrobatics or something.
Or stealth or anything like that.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's I think it's balanced by the fact that it's a second level slot, which I think is pretty reasonable. And it actually, in fairness, finally puts something at second level slots that doesn't suck. Because second level spells, as we know, are the ones that everyone's just rushing past because it's the stop on their way to third level, and it's really not bad. I mean, yes, there are some good second level spells. Everybody that's about to write in, but it's more of a I think this is actually quite situationally useful and very much again to your earlier point, it lends itself well to the fact this is a role playing kind of designed adventure, right? So where an hour's worth of a skill could actually be really cool.
Yeah, I think so. And for me, the second level spell that I was like, oh, that's quite interesting, is the Wither and Bloom one, which is this idea that it invokes both life and death within a sphere, like a 10 radius sphere centered on a point within range, and each creature must make a Constitution saving throw or take 2d6 necrotic damage, which is pretty brutal itself. If you're using this sort of second level, you're probably going to be lower levels. But then, as a sort of next part of it, one creature of your choice can spend an unspent hit die to regain hit points, plus your spell modifier, and each higher level is a d6 more for damage and also one higher hit point. So this idea that you're sort of draining, it's almost like what I think of like Odish, these sort of Pokemon that sort of mega drain and then giving it back to somebody else. It's like it's just again very magical, very cool, very flavoursome in a way, and a little bit different, I thought.
It's actually quite powerful for a second level spell, which is the fact that it's going to do 2d6 necrotic, right? And it still does half damage on the success, but it's pretty decent, I think. It also has a very interesting line there. It says non-magical vegetation in that area withers. Which is pretty good as well, right? I mean, it's got, I think you have to wait for Blight before that can happen otherwise. The other one, before we get on to the spicy one that's been causing all the drama, is Vortex Warp. Basically, a target fails a Constitution save after you cast this second level spell, and then you teleport it to an unoccupied space of your choice you can see within range. It must be on a surface or in a liquid that can support the target without the target having to squeeze. But that has, again, lots of interesting situational use, especially if you combo it with somebody casting Bane and someone else casting something else. You then end up with quite a powerful way of moving an opponent, and at the end of the day, positioning in combat is pretty critical, right, in D&D. I don't see what the range of it is. Oh, it's 90 feet, so it's 90 feet range.
Feet. It's pretty big, and with higher levels, it's plus 30 feet on top of that. So
that's pretty spicy.
That is pretty cool. That's the thing. I think if it's like, within 30 feet or 60 feet, where that's what I normally think of, when you think of Misty Step or any of these other things. And then I'm like, within 90 feet at a base level of level 2, that's pretty cool. And then, but if you're going up to level 4, that's an extra 60 feet on top of that, 150 feet. Like, where are you putting these people? You could literally, if someone's coming charging towards you, you're like, oh no. And you move them back 150 feet. So by the time they get to you, they're completely knackered or something like that. I don't know. But
the other thing is, and it says the target can choose to fail.
Yes.
So it allows you to bring people out of combat. And effectively, for a second level slot, you are able to completely negate an enemy's movement, in essence, because 90 feet is a lot of movement. There aren't that many creatures that can do 90 feet of movement in a round, and still attack and do damage and all the rest of it. Certainly not at level 3, which is when you'll be able to cast this spell. It's actually a very powerful spell when you use it on your allies.
It's a really good spell, and I think it's one of those ones where you have to maybe think about it, how you would adapt it. Like you said, it's not necessarily a combat spell, I think you could use it in all sorts of situations. So I really, really like Kinetic Jaunt.
Yeah, it's rad. So, now, before we move on, silvery barbs. Silvery barbs. It's Christmas time. Now, it certainly is bloody Christmas time, I'll tell you that much. Now, first level enchantment spell. Obviously, I think Silver Quill get this spell as their sort of like spell, but obviously it's in the game now. One reaction, which you take when a creature you can see within 60 feet of yourself succeeds an attack roll, an ability check, or a saving throw. And you magically distract the triggering creature and turn its momentary uncertainty into encouragement for another creature. The triggering creature must re-roll the d20 and use the lower roll. You can then choose a different creature you can see within range. You can choose yourself. The roll, ability check, or saving throw it makes within 1 minute, which is, 10 rounds.
Yeah, a lot of time.
Is all the time.
Yeah.
A creature can only be empowered by one use of the spell at a time, meaning that at least you can't stack multiple advantages for yourself to use whatever you want to. Now, that is a heinously overpowered spell.
Yes.
Shield isn't a heinously overpowered spell, but this is, even more heinously
at least
overpowered.
shield ends at the end of your turn.
Absolutely.
I think, for me, I would tweak this so it is within the next turn. You're on your next turn. The next thing you do has advantage, whatever it may be. Because, you could just literally use all of your spell slots to constantly debuff somebody else, and so that you get that advantage, which will be not very fun, I don't think. Because that's the thing, it's a creature, right? So it's not only just the enemies you're attacking, it could be somebody else you're just trying to really annoy in your party and all that sort of thing. So
just had a quick look at the errata, and so the only thing they've really clarified, they certainly haven't constrained the power of the spell, that can the silvery barb spell in Strixhaven affect legendary resistance? No. When a creature uses legendary resistance, the creature returns a failed saving throw into a success regardless of the dice roll, the number rolled. Now, the question I have about silvery barbs is, it says the triggering creature must roll the d20 and use the lower roll.
Yes.
Now, what if the creature is attacking with advantage or disadvantage?
Because you can't really have double disadvantage or double advantage, do you?
Right.
It's just, I think you just take it as it is already at disadvantage, or it's just, it's now a straight roll or whatever.
Right. So another generous, perhaps, reading of this would be that it is when you succeed an attack roll, an ability check, or saving throw. So if you roll with advantage or disadvantage, right, you could say, if one dice fails, one dice succeeds, right? That's the dice that succeeded, roll it again.
I see. Rather than if you get hit, for example, even if it's with that lower dice.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that definitely this is one that is going to cause some fun at the table. So DMs, beware. So that's another of the spells. I think that we probably glossed over one, which is called Kinetic Jaunt. It's just a movement speed one, and it's useful, nice little spell. Perhaps not worth
pretty
a second
cool
level
looking.
slot.
Like it like you were magically empowering your movement, like dance-like steps. So again, can be quite flavoursome, and you just increase your walking speed. You don't provoke opportunity attacks, which is pretty good.
Right. So how's that different to Zephyr Strike?
It's probably just another flavoursome way of doing it. I think that's literally it. I think, and that's the thing as well. Some of these, I wonder if they did expand on the spell list or even the magical items, quite a lot of it would just be reusing same content, just with a different name. And
then we come on to magical items.
Yes.
Now, how do you feel about these magical items?
There's not many of them, is there?
There aren't many of them, and I like the fact that some of them are quite cute and mundane. I like the fact there has the endless jug of coffee, and
I do like that as a sort of like here's
but they don't tell you what coffee does, by the way. That's the other weird thing. It's just like it's completely just an endless jug of coffee. So it's a total flavor item entirely,
100%.
which I really like. Right?
Yes.
It's not like the endless alcohol where alcohol has a sort of detrimental effect on you. I don't believe coffee has any kind of effect on you in the game. However, the cuddly mascot, is another, quite nice little flavoury one. But then you get the primers, and there are one for each of the houses we talked about. So Lorehold, Prismari, Quandrix, and Silverquill. And they are kind of limited daily blesses, for want of a better phrase, which have got a little bit of additional once a day you can cast a spell from the primer. What is interesting is you can study the primer every day and choose a different spell by my reading. The general interpretation of this is when it doesn't say the entirety of the list or any bard or cleric spell, it's only the default ones. So specific school spells, bard college spells that they get access to wouldn't be included, and you wouldn't get access to the ones that were given to you by magical secrets and things like that. But even so, that is still, especially for Prisbari, of course, and especially for Quandrix, that is still quite significant, and certainly for a level 1, level 2 character, a fighter, rogue, non-spellcasting character, quite useful. And actually, if you take that and you add it to the background, you can now cast 2 first level spells in any given day. And of course, if a mage has it, they can cast whatever they can cast plus an additional 2. So that's quite spicy.
Yeah, I think overall, when you look at it, you do get a lot of spells if you are a non-magic user at Strixhaven. If you take the background feat, if you get one of these primers, you can set yourself up to have it. I think the only thing my little tiny little bit of admin hatred there is there's a lot to, if you need to manage where does it come from, stuff like that. I'm sure if you're using something like D&D Beyond, it's a little bit more manageable, but if you're just giving these to your players and you're playing in person, it's all still on paper and pen, it's a bit having to work out where things are going. That for me, that sort of takes it out of the immersion a little bit. This spell comes from here, this spell comes from there, this one comes from my background. No one's really keeping track. You don't remember the days when you're I forgot this spell and it came from here. You remember fighting the boggart in the bathroom. That's the days you remember. You don't remember the admin side of magic.
No, exactly. I think there is a level of bookkeeping that needs to be streamlined in the game as a whole, actually. What I do think is missing from this book, however, and it seems like an obvious one, is wands. For a Harry Potter-esque / type book, right? You would think wands and sorting hats and various other things like that would be prevalent, but there's none of that. There's not that much beyond a few books. Maybe there's a pennant of the school, school colours, and the mascot and the coffee in terms of magical items that you would get here. Whereas I think there's plenty of them in the sort of the trope, as it were.
It's that sort of thing. Maybe they're trying to focus less on the magical school aspect of it and more on the school aspect of it, right? Because if you go to any university in America, they'll have their shops filled with t-shirts and baseball caps and backpacks and notebooks, all with the branding on it. But they don't do anything out of the ordinary. And I wonder here, it's the same thing. We already have the magical items you get from the DM's guide and the player's handbook and all that sort of thing. And so stuff maybe a broom of flying. Well, we've already got that. You can put that in. You don't need, unless you want to put in, I don't know, Strixhaven branding on it. So I do think it's quite tricky when you think of stuff like we said, Harry Potter. There's always other sort of magical stuff that makes things a little bit different. But does it have any mechanical benefit per se? Again, this whole campaign setting is sort of revolved around this idea of that it is social role play. So you can easily come up with the magical effects, but it doesn't necessarily give you an advantage in the social interaction. But then I do think maybe the most interesting one, we sort of quickly mentioned it, the sort of cuddly Strixhaven mascot, this idea that it can attach itself to any limb and stay there, which I think is quite frightening in itself. But I can imagine as a distraction technique, using it and just putting it on some big bad's face, in the way, and they're struggling to remove it, but then they can't see.
You can only press it to your arm, shoulder, or leg as an action, and it's your arm.
I would tweet that to make sure you could put it to somebody's face. Why wouldn't you do that, right? Why wouldn't you
mascot to the face?
Exactly.
However, kind of counterpoint to the fact that perhaps it's a bit light on magical items and perhaps it's a bit light on feats and various other things like that, is the friends and foes section at the end. And now it's not a full monstrous manual, but it's a good 30 pages or so, maybe slightly more, 40 pages or so of content, right? And there's way too many to go through, so I suggest what we do is we just pick a couple of the ones that we really like. The one that I liked the most, just straight off the bat, was, I believe it's called the Mage Hunter. And I like the fact that It's blatantly a Tyranid from Warhammer 40k because it looks just like a Tyranid, but they're sort of mage hunters are these hideous spider-legged creatures employed by the Auric, who, spoiler alert, the bad people, to pursue magic wielders. They can naturally sense magic via their glowing purple spines in their backs, which I think is brilliant. I don't recall coming across another creature who has this special ability, and so their special ability is magic sense. They know the location of every spellcaster, active spell, and magic item within 120 feet.
Oof.
I've never come across that ability before. I'm willing to be wrong about that. This thing looks a bit like a Neogi for those of you who are familiar with Spelljammer, and if you're not, you soon will be. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Spelljammer, they're basically like these sort of horrible spider pirate creatures that are cannibals and really nasty pieces of work. But I think the idea of being chased by one or two of these things at a low level is genuinely terrifying, especially if you're a magic user and therefore your abilities are like, cool, well, I will cast invisibility. It's like, nope. No. And I will do, a spell. I'll bless myself. Nope. You're going to give yourself away by the very thing that the school is predicated around, which is the use of magic items, which I think is also use of magic spells. I think that's wonderful. And they're not slouches either. Like 85 hit points. Yeah. They can climb 40 feet. They can fly in one of their other forms. They're a CR5, but CR doesn't mean anything anyway. So I presume they're not meant to be met by first or second level players. Mm-hmm. But I would definitely have first and second level players meet one of these.
100%.
Because it's like Alien.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. This idea that having these creatures here in Strixhaven, the place where all the magic is, this will cause a riot. And again, minor spoiler alert, but during your second year, you're having that big sporting day, game day event. These creatures come and attack. And you can imagine a whole stadium filled with people, magic effects going off. You're using spells to try and win the game. And then suddenly these creatures like almost swarm over the playing field coming towards you. They're quite terrifying. And yeah, just looking at the reaction they have, the consume and destroy. So you, as a spellcaster, you could take that damage. Trying to get these creatures to die. So that's the thing. The biggest weapon that you have to hand maybe isn't magic. Maybe you have to rely on those people who don't use magic as an offensive force. It is those people who go in, get the big sword, get the whatever improvised weapon they have if they're playing on the game day, and having to hit these creatures, which also have an AC of 15. That's a high AC for levels 1, 2, and 3. If you're putting them up against your players around you.
100%. And conditional immunities, it's incredibly perceptive. It's got blind sight to 120 feet, has a passive perception of 19, right? Mm-hmm. So, not that I'm suggesting you do this to your players, but if you want one of these creatures to chase your players through the dark halls of their school and then stalk them whilst they silently try to hide, I thoroughly applaud you. Now, what is your favourite, friend or foe?
So for me, and I'm basing this purely on looks really, is the Cogwork Archivist, which is used in the Biblioplex in the central campus. And they are the creatures that put away the books, essentially. But they look so cool, and they look cool. Like, it's that beautiful point between fantasy and steampunk, but in such a very beautiful, elegant design. Like, they're on wheels, they look the part, and they've got a bit of spell casting, got some grasping limbs, stuff like that, but they're not meant for combat. They're supposed to put people back in their place if they're being too noisy in the library. They're that sort of creatures. But I think just because they look so big as well, like they're towering creatures, and just to look at them having really emphasizes that magic.
It's a construct, it's immune to poison, it's got immune to charm, so you can't charm the librarian to get it to do something for you. It's a CR4, but it's got a high armor class of 17. So it's and it's got a few tricks to it, but nothing too long. And I imagine that most of the time you're not aiming to run around the library clubbing librarians. So
we hope not. Not in my Strixhaven game.
It's very interesting. So there are lots of other things here. You definitely get each of the dragons that founded the school.
Yep.
They show up. The oracle that is, supposed to make sure that Strixhaven is a good place and blah, 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 shows up too. They've got examples of what like a first year student looks like. And the art in this book, by the way, is super cool. There's lots of it as well. I'm flipping page to page, and every single page has got, pretty much, that's not quite true because the adventure in the middle doesn't quite have that, but, many pages have got both diverse and interesting art, which I think is fantastic. In summary, Fiona, as we draw to the end of our second special episode, courtesy of our friends at Hasbro about Strixhaven, thank you very much, lovely people. Ooh, fancy.
There you go.
It's a beautiful cover. I like all the special editions in general. This is quite sort of mandala, sort of like, magic-y mage type. So I'm a fan of this sort of purple as well. It is surprisingly coherent and well put together book. Your thoughts?
This is everything you need to do that sort of jumping off point if you want to really set a couple of adventures within a magical institution, or like if you like, I really enjoy Candlekeep, which is obviously the biggest library in the Forgotten Realms, but you wanted to add a reason why people are there, and it's something a bit more than just going for one book. I really like the optional rules as well. I know we haven't really dived too much into them, but stuff like having the exams, I think that's a really interesting, different way of like giving bonuses to your players, so it's not necessarily just relying on a dice roll to get something right. You get an extra d4 for the student dice, and I actually really like the relationship stuff.
Yes, no, actually, it's worth taking a second to talk about that, because I think it's fascinatingly good. I think the idea that you basically there's a mini game to make social interaction inside D&D have some reward to it. With this concept of, I think it's relationship points and
so the idea is that you have sort of 3 levels of it. You have sort of your friends, you've got rivals, and you've got beloveds, and basically it's just like a -2 they're going to be rivals, a +2 they're going to be your friends, and then a beloved is just one step beyond that, and you get little different things with different obviously levels. What I quite like though, so essentially if you have someone who is a rival or a friend, they give you a boon or a bane, and you can really read about it in the sort of the NPC section of it, and it's really nice because each little NPC has their own little background about who they are, what extracurricular activities or jobs they have, where you might interact with them, and what the boon and bane is depending on what your relationship is with them. And what's really good about it is that it's not super advantageous in combat, but it might be really, really, a cool role-playing thing, or it might just help you. So for example, and forgive me, I can't remember which one it is, but there is there's someone who is an illusion mage of some sort, and if you're really good friends with her, she can cause big distractions with her magic, so you can easily get away with something. But I think she's Prismari, so the bane of it is that you always get the worst seats to whenever you go to any of the shows, because she has an influence on like how you get a good seat and stuff like that. Little taste of things like that, which aren't necessarily here as a mechanic for you to like roll a dice from. It's all about that interpretation, which I really, really like.
It creates a reward for building a relationship, and it creates a consequence for creating a negative outcome, and of course I think then it's down to the DM to put people in that lovely situation of having to pick one or the other, right? Which I think is very much in some ways representative of what college days and school days certainly are like, right? So overall then, you're not a fan?
I'm not a fan. No, I think there's a lot in it, and I can understand why it maybe has been a bit of a mix in terms of reception, perhaps. I think a lot of people had an idea of what it was going to be. Like you said, this idea of like, it's Harry Potter but D&D. I don't think it's that at all. I think it takes those inspirations from these books, certainly from any sort of fantasy or high magic sort of thing. Like for me, I take a lot of The Worst Witch, right? Jill Murphy, I believe she's called. That idea that you are in school, you've got all these exams to do, but there's also a bigger threat you need to deal with as well. So I think it's just something very different, and using these optional rules as well. You can, again, they're all optional. You don't have to do it. You could completely add loads of combat encounters and stuff like that, as long as I think you justify it within this context of there is a bigger authority above you, and it's the worst one in the world. It's school authority. You're adventurers, but you are having to act within this very tight sort of system that if you muck up, you'll be expelled, and that's the worst thing in the world, right? When you're that age, or when you're learning to do something and be the best mage of all of Strixhaven. So I think there's a lot in it, and I think there's a lot of inspiration. So I definitely would recommend having a read of it for sure.
Well, I'm definitely looking forward to the background Strixhaven dropout because I think that'll probably be the most appropriate one for me. But nevertheless, I just want to say a massive thank you, Fiona, for coming and joining me and helping me wade through the book. I've got to say, I am thrilled that our friends over at Hasbro asked us to have a look at this. It's really not bad. Not bad at all. On that note, this has been Game Theory about Strixhaven, a curriculum of chaos. We're going to say goodnight. Thank you very much, folks. Bye.
Bye.